For the tools of the task, please welcome Chris Carberry, CEO and co-founder of Explore Mars, Inc., Dr. Robert Zubrin, founder and president of the Mars Society, and Lynne Dittmar, executive director for the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome the Atlantic's Alexis Madrigal.
Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. You guys can take your seats. Now we get into some of the specifics, some of the fun things about exploring our solar system. We have three distinguished experts with overlapping but independent expertise around deep space exploration, in particular Mars. I just want to know how many doubters we have in the room. How many people think that we're going to land humans on Mars in their lifetime? So pretty much everybody believes we're going to get there at some point. It's just a matter of when, and we're gonna get into that. Let's start with the basics, and maybe Chris or anybody can take this one. Actually, I mean, why Mars? Why the emphasis on Mars?
Well, from my perspective, and Robert and Lynne will go into this also. It's all closest place we can send humans. We're going to learn some of the big questions, like is there life in the solar system another place other than Earth? It's also the place we can send humans where we can actually live off the land, to use ISRU and utilize the water and the atmosphere. So there's a lot going for it that we can't go to other places, or the moon doesn't actually have, at least in the quantity that Mars has. Plus, I think there's no other destination we have right now that's captured the imagination. Everything is Mars these days. There's tremendous support for Mars, more than we've ever seen. I think there really is a precedence for sending humans to Mars, in the next, 1 to 2 decades.
Yeah, and you were saying backstage that when you went into congressional offices in the 1990s, people rolled their eyes at you, and now people are interested.
Yeah, it literally is night and day. When back in the 90s, when we were visiting congressional offices, literally, they were rolling their eyes. They were looking at you as though they were wearing Vulcan ears. And at the time...
To be fair, you actually wear them.
I was not wearing them. Yeah. I was wearing my Klingon outfit, but not my Vulcan ears. No, but, at the time, NASA wasn't even able to talk about sending humans to Mars. They literally were not allowed to actually talk about it. But now you go in, even places where, when I go into congressional offices, you look at the procurement numbers for their district, I will literally look at it and I'll see a 0. There aren't too many congressional districts with a 0 for NASA funding, but even some of those where you think you're going to go in and find absolutely no support, we're shocked. We go in, you find the most enthusiastic people are just gung-ho, because it's not just, a lot of people say it's based on if there's a NASA district, a NASA facility in their district. That's not even the case anymore. I think there's genuine passion right now all across the country to actually achieve this. And so we just need to really lean forward. We have an opportunity right now to get this done, but we can't be timid. We have to find a way of getting humans on the surface of the planet by the early 2030s.
Bob, this has been one of your things you've wanted to do for decades. You've wanted to land people on Mars. And you've kind of at times made more cultural arguments about why we need to do this kind of exploration and why specifically Mars. Can you just, in 1 minute, gloss those for the audience?
Well, just first to reinforce that, Mars is where the science is, Mars is where the challenge is, Mars is where the future is. And look, from a technological point of view, we're much closer to being able to send humans to Mars today than we were to being able to send men to the moon in 1961, and we were there 8 years later. If we had an actual commitment to send humans to Mars, which we do not, what we have right now is just drift. It is not a program. But if we had a real commitment, we could be on Mars within 8 years. And to say that we can't is to say that we have become less than the kind of people that we used to be, which is something that this country cannot afford.
Yeah. But what do you make of the end of the Apollo program so soon after having landed, humans on the moon?
Well, that was a historical mistake. It was as if Ferdinand and Isabella had welcomed Columbus back from the New World and said, oh, so what? Burn the fleet. So history went off the rail, and we have never restarted it. We've never had the complete conjunction of adequate presidential leadership, congressional support, and NASA leadership all at the same time that we had in the 60s. That's what we need. We need a president who can rally such support, which maybe we don't, and a Congress that's willing to follow and deliver, and a NASA that is willing to think. I mean, you take this thing we heard today about a lunar orbit space station. If anybody was told, you're the manager of Humans to Mars program, here's your budget, let's see you get to Mars, the idea of spending part of it on a lunar orbiting space station wouldn't cross their mind. It is not needed to go to Mars, it's not needed to go to the moon. It is just a project to be done. Right now, NASA is not spending money to do things, it is doing things to spend money, and that needs to be corrected. The way we got to the moon was not by finding something to do for a random set of constituently supported programs. Rather, the way it happened was we had a president who set a goal and a timeline within his own time, and then from that goal came a plan. From that plan came a set of vehicles. From that set of vehicles came a variety of technology development programs needed to create those vehicles. We didn't go to the moon to give our lunar excursion module lobby something to do. Okay, we had lunar excursion modules because we had a moon program. The robotic Mars program is successful because it is mission driven. Okay, we developed airbags so we could land rovers on Mars. We didn't land rovers on Mars in order to have employment for airbags. Okay,
right.
And so we need leadership. We need leadership at the top of the government and at the top of NASA, and we don't have it right now.
Mary Lynne, I want to ask you about, just so we make sure everyone is on the same page. What is as you see it, the sort of base case? Like, let's say nothing tremendously different happens over the next few years. Are we on a path to actually get humans on Mars in the early 2030s? And what might inflect that path and be able to push it up or back in time?
Whether or not we're on a path to get people on Mars in the early 2030s depends on who we is. The we, that is NASA, has a forward plan. Bob may not like it, but there is a forward plan. It is certainly a plan that's in development. It's a plan that's evolving. It is not a plan that's carved in stone. It's a plan that, to defend NASA for a minute, they have to operate under a tremendous number of constraints. And those constraints involve a broad constituency or set of constituencies, some of whom are political, some of whom are international, some of whom are industry, some of whom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to operate within those constraints is a difficult task. There's not sufficient funding to be able to go there and hit the mark as quickly or as directly as we would like to have. I mean, I'm just sort of say that directly. I'm not speaking for NASA at this point. Let me be clear. Speaking for me, there's not sufficient funding to be able to do that. There's technology development that still needs to occur in order to be able to go to Mars, and there are some cases, Ellen Stefan referred to some of them, which are relatively short-term, like an ecosystem that will actually allow us to go into deep space. ECLIS is environmental life support, basically allows us to go into space and stay there for a long period of time. We still don't have one. We have one, but it has a really high maintenance requirement, and you can't have that over time. It needs to be replenished. Can't have that over time. If we're operating a whole lot of miles away from Earth, it's not like we're going to send oxygen ships out every now and then to replenish the ecosystem because it's not working properly. It would really be good to have nuclear thermal propulsion to be able to go to Mars. It's not an absolute necessity, but it'd be a lovely thing to be able to have. And there's other technologies that I think need to be developed. So to echo a little bit about what Bob said, the focus, which is going to have to be, it's politically driven, okay, in this country. In other words, the country they don't undertake programs of any kind, any initiative, anywhere, okay, unless there's appropriate political support. NASA has very strong bipartisan support and has had that for a long time, but the fact of the matter is that compared to other national priorities, space simply hasn't been that high on the list.
Yeah. You know, recently signed by President Trump was the NASA Transition Authorization Act, mentions Mars and Mars programs 28 times. Did that change anything? Did that do anything?
No, it was a slight improvement on Obama's NASA budget. It was not a remarkable change. And if you do think that nuclear thermal propulsion is vital to get humans to Mars, then you ought to have a nuclear thermal propulsion development program, which they do not. Okay. But also, I mean, look, I once again have to come back to this. There is not a plan. There is random activity. If a lunar orbiting space station was a vital step on the way to Mars, how come it didn't figure into any of von Braun's plans, in the 90-day report, into Mars Direct, into the design reference mission, into the vision for space exploration? It didn't, because it isn't needed.
Well,
it is just
let me ask you what
it's a boondoggle.
You don't think it has anything to do with the speed of carrying out missions or any of the, what are the backers of this? Do people know what we're talking about here? No. I'm going to come to you.
Oh, okay. So NASA rolled out a plan at, I don't know, a couple of months ago now, maybe a month ago, don't remember. Basically for the next several steps in development on what was called the journey to Mars. So completion of SLS, which is the big rocket, and Orion, and then the next step after that is for a cislunar HAB, which they're now calling the Deep Space Gateway, which has evolved somewhat in its design and focus. And the idea of that is to get that out into lunar orbit, and then to use it as a test bed for humans in basically being out in deep space for a long period of time, also other biological systems, also probably some technology development. And the other thing that NASA is envisioning is that international partners can play a role in that. One of the things that we haven't really talked about a lot today, but I do want to emphasize, is that pretty much everyone has agreed, numerous studies from the national academies, NASA's work, a lot of other people have agreed that basically moving forward to Mars is an international prospect. There are some people who disagree with that, okay, but the position of the United States, as exemplified in the Transition Act that you just mentioned, is that us going to Mars is basically going to be done in partnership, and it's going to be in partnership with international partners as well as in partnership with industry partners. So part of the idea of the Deep Space Gateway is that that's an opportunity essentially for international partners, for industry partners to be able to contribute to development as well as to make use of that as they see fit.
Chris, I want to come to you because I think at least some of the excitement around Mars is because of Elon Musk and Bezos sort of doing things in space that people weren't doing before. How do you look at their plans? I mean, we've seen Mars by 2025 and things of that nature. What do you think?
I think it's very exciting. I think a lot of them are aspirational. SpaceX and Blue Origin are doing remarkable things. Do I think SpaceX is going to land humans on Mars by 2025? I don't think so. I think Elon's also said he doesn't have the money to do it, and I think he's created a very large plan, it seems. But I think he's excited the public, and I think in the end it's going to take a combination of efforts. It's not going to just be SpaceX, it's not going to just be NASA and the other players. I think it's going to take the combined efforts, finding the right balance of all these capabilities. I think there's a lot of stuff being developed right now, and so one thing I agree with Robert on, we do need to make some decisions. We need to kind of have a clear path, from here to Mars. I don't necessarily agree with Robert on everything, but a lot of very key decisions need to be made very soon to show that we are on this path to get to Mars. That includes SpaceX and Blue Origin and Boeing, Lockheed, Aerojet, Orbital ATK, and finding the right balance. Because it's not just about finding the most efficient, the cheapest mission you can create, because that might actually not be the most politically realistic. I like coming at it from here. Just because you could do this about as efficiently as possible, it's not necessarily going to have the political support you need to sustain it. When Robert was talking about, like for instance, when JFK made his speech and then we went to the moon in 8 years, it was a different era. I think one of the traps we get into in the space community is we're waiting along for the magical Kennedy-like speech, which isn't going to be coming. I think something that matches the era we're in might come. There are a lot of variables that we cannot replicate from the 1960s, but in some ways I think
the Cold War, for example.
Well, the Cold War, yeah, and there was one reason for going to the moon, at least politically, to beat the Soviets to the moon. We did that, and then we had no justification for staying. It was not a sustainable program. Right now, even though we're not as focused as maybe we should be, I agree with that 100%, I think we actually have a stronger case to create a sustainable program. We have a lot more reasons for going to Mars. Sometimes it gets a little bit confusing because there are so many good reasons. It's not as easy to articulate as we're going to beat the Soviet Union, but we need to articulate that. So if we can get the right path going, I think we can actually do a much better job at creating a sustainable program where we'll actually go to Mars and we'll stay.
Yeah.
Okay. Look, there's an infinite number of alternative activities one can say they need to do before they go to Mars. Last year, it was to put a 500-ton rock in lunar orbit. Okay, that was supposedly a key step on the way to Mars. It had nothing to do with it. It was just something that had certain constituency support. We it really needs to be understood. There needs to be leadership. Now, SpaceX has a better chance of sending humans to Mars than NASA does now, despite the fact that it's got 1 to 2 orders of magnitude lower resources, because the person leading SpaceX actually wants to go to Mars. Now, I'm an astronautical engineer. I wrote a detailed critique of Musk's plan. There's a lot of interesting ideas in it. I think it needs to be disciplined away from the gigantic scale of it, and if it is, I think it could work, and I think he could put humans on Mars by the end of the 2020s, although that's by no means certain. There's all sorts of things that can get in the way of that. But where there's a will, there's a way. Where there is not a will, there is not a way.
Let's talk about some of the challenges, the individual technical challenges to overcome. Maybe let's start with just how we're going to get there. You mentioned nuclear thermal propulsion. How long with the sort of current generation of technology would it take us to get to Mars? And what do you think that time needs to be cut down to make it realistic, to have a continuing program on Mars?
Well, the current generation, I'm not quite sure how to answer the question, because the current generation of launch vehicles, to get to Mars, basically, we would have to launch a whole lot of stuff into Earth orbit, assemble it, and then start pushing it to Mars. The idea of, or take little tiny bits at a time, over a long period of time. The idea of the Space Launch System is that it can land much, much, much larger payloads. And so that was its conception, the idea that you would be able to take large payloads into deep space. I do think there's one thing that we miss a lot, though, and that is that a lot of the discussion about getting to Mars is about the how to get to Mars. There's really not enough discussion, in my view, about what happens when you get to Mars. So getting to Mars is like certainly it's a large part of the equation, but I would argue that there's a great many resources, both in industry and in government, that are being put in to develop that right now. There are also some resources that are being put into what you're actually going to do on the surface. But surviving on the surface, if you can't survive on the surface, then why the heck are you going in the first place? So we use the International Space Station right now as a test bed for a lot of those technologies. Mentioned before the environmental control system, but also we want to be able to not have to haul our food with us all the time, right? So we want to be able to grow crops. How many of you have watched The Martian? Okay, Mark Watney, okay, he did it with potatoes and some very interesting biological matter, okay, which allowed him to be able to sort of grow potatoes. But right now on the space station, for example, there are a number of experiments that fall under the name veggie, okay, which are really about growing vegetables in space, okay? And it's harder than it sounds if you think about it for a minute, and tell the story and then sort of allow you to move on. But if you think about it for a minute, how many of you have bought vegetables and basically stuck them in a bag in order to be able to ripen them? Anybody ever done that? Tomatoes, you get some green tomatoes, you stick them in a bag, they ripen faster. Do you know why? There's a gas that they emit, okay, as they're ripening, and basically the presence of that gas actually facilitates additional ripening. And so when you stick them in a bag, what you're basically doing is putting them in an enclosed environment, okay, so that they basically start to ripen faster. What is the space station?
A bag.
An enclosed environment, okay? And the situation, the place in which they actually grow itself is enclosed. So you have a problem. So you have to be able to remove some of that gas. So there's actually been a technology that's been developed to be able to pull that gas out, which is now being used on Earth, okay, to be able to sort of extract gases in environments where you don't want them. Those kinds of things we only learn by doing. And that's really critical, okay, for us to be able to figure out how it is that we're going to survive on Mars.
Let's talk about landing on Mars. We'll go the middle step. You took the end. So let's talk about actually landing on Mars. Bob, do you think what would be your preferred plan?
Since I'm an old-fashioned engineer and I started my aerospace career working in the same Martin Marietta group that did the Viking landing on Mars, my preferred route would be parachutes and retro rockets to soft land. And that, by the way, was done in 1976 when we had computers that were 1/1,000,000th as good as those that are in the pocket of every person in this room. Okay, so the idea that we need new revolutionary computers to land on Mars is incredible. Now, of course, Musk has just demonstrated something that 2 years ago I would have thought was science fiction, 3 years ago anyway, which was supersonic retropropulsion. He's now doing it routinely to land his boosters on Earth. You could also do that on Mars, and that, in fact, is part of his approach, and it's now credible for exactly that reason. But you know, a few years ago, you had NASA people saying, oh, we can't send humans to Mars because it would require parachutes much bigger than any developed before. Now, Hello. When we sent humans to the moon, we mastered technical challenges a lot harder than building bigger parachutes. Okay? I mean, this is crazy. This is looking for excuses. Okay? This is not a reason why we can't go to Mars. This is a certain technical challenge that can be readily addressed. And you know, I mean, one of the things we should be doing in this next decade is shooting 30-ton payloads to Mars using a cryogenic upper stage on SLS or Falcon Heavies, and landing them on Mars, major payloads, not putting a space station in lunar orbit so we can examine the effects of solar flares on human physiology, which, as far as I'm concerned, is unethical medical research. It's not a space program.
Yeah, we had recently we released a report called the Mars Achievability and Sustainability Report, which actually, we had a workshop. Every year we have a workshop bringing together stakeholders, Mars architects, scientists, et cetera, about 50 or 60 people. And this year we released, it's about a 90-page report looking at actually these issues, the tall pole issues, things like entry, descent, landing, ECLIS, life support, et cetera, ISRU, and surface power. And so we wanted to make sure to really address these issues because there has been so much focus and kind of obsession over which launch vehicle we're going to use and other ones that get a lot of press. But this is a good question because there are a lot of these technologies, that we can manage, but we have to start working on right now. This is why it's so important that we make the decisions, because it's a lot more than making a decision. We actually have to start on these capabilities. Even I'm the only one without technical background here. I'm a political guy, but I know for a fact in all these discussions, for instance, entry, descent, and landing, whether it's using Robert's approach or something else, is an enormous challenge, and we have to start figuring it out. The biggest thing we've landed on Mars is the Curiosity rover, and we'll probably need something at least 20 times as big as that.
Yeah, I'm also, last sort of individual technology I want to talk about is, it's more of just the general challenge of this communication gap as the presumed astronauts would get closer and closer to Mars. How do you think that will play out? Because it's not really so much an individual technology as much as it is like you need to develop a system of working that makes sense within this incredibly bizarre environment with a massive communication delay.
So really going back very early in my career, we were looking at latencies in communication. Latency is just the time that it takes between when you issue a transmission and when it gets to wherever you're going, and then it's going, and then basically the time coming back. So round-trip latency is just basically how much time it takes to get there and come back. Mars, about 40 minutes. We looked at a lot of ways to sort of fill in the gap by simulating activities. So for example, if you had a set of procedures that you were going to execute in a certain period of time, my background's in space operations, if you had a periods of procedures that you were going to execute, when you send the commands, or basically that somebody's supposed to be doing that, okay, you can simulate that, okay, on Earth, and so you have some sense about where they should be. Meanwhile, the folks up there could simulate things going back. This is really unwieldy, and there's a whole lot of ways that it can go wrong. So one thing that's going to have to happen is that over time, and certainly NASA's aware of this, and other industry partners are aware of this, we're going to have to develop ways of operating that just have a whole heck of a lot more autonomy. And perhaps those ways of operating than we have right now on station. And there have been a couple of exercises of that. And then certainly there's the moon, where there was a slight latency, very slight compared to Mars. So you'd have to operate a lot more autonomously. A couple of things that may help with that are the development of more capable robotic help. Okay, so robotic help that's available that has some additional AI built in it relative to what we're talking about right now, okay, will be really helpful with regard to doing that. But the other thing does have to do with improving our communications capabilities. Right now there's a deep space network that is the primary pipe by which we basically communicate with craft that are going out into deep space. It's heavily subscribed. One could argue oversubscribed. And it doesn't help with the latency issue very much. There's work that's being done in optical communications, which is essentially laser communications. But what most people think we're going to do is essentially string a series of communication nodes out further than we are right now. That may be work that can be done in deep lunar orbit, and then as well as the sort of Lagrangian points as you move on. There's a number of different architectures for addressing it, but the bottom line for me is that human explorers through history have basically operated relatively autonomously. They're not always in touch with home. That's why crew training and crew selection is really important. It's why developing your capabilities is really important. It's why making sure that you've ensured the opportunity for people to actually be able to thrive and survive in space is very important. And we're going to have to put a lot of time and effort in to be able to do that, because once you get out there, bottom line, those folks are going to be on their own.
Yeah, and that is the point. The human
Get your
psyche.
questions ready, only because after this answer, we're going to take 2 audience questions.
All right. The crew's going to have with them a computer vastly better than anything NASA has on Earth, namely their brains, okay? And as far as robots and such, we're on the point right now of deploying self-driving cars that can negotiate the traffic in New York City and Los Angeles. There's a lot less traffic on Mars. Okay? So really, we do not need to command either the crew or their robotic assistants like marionettes. They will be able to handle themselves.
Questions?
Yeah, hi, Frank Slazer with Aerospace Industries Association. I'll ask an unpopular question, probably, but one I think that needs some thought. Mars is a great place to go. Looking forward to the first humans on Mars. A lot of people talk about Mars colonies and making permanent settlements there. Last time I looked, colonies require some form of trade to pay for them, and gold, potatoes, tobacco, name your commodity. I don't think that we know of anything coming back from Mars that's going to make an economic proposition of settling it. And if you want to save the human race by having a multi-planet species, wouldn't the moon be much better? What's the long-term case for mass colonization of Mars?
I'd like to answer this. Okay.
I'm shocked by that, Bob.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, first of all, you need to understand there's no such thing as a natural resource. There's only natural raw materials. Land on Earth was not a resource until we invented agriculture. Oil was not a resource until we developed petroleum drilling, refining, and machines that could use the product. Uranium, not a resource until we developed nuclear power. It is people who are resourceful. Okay, there are no resources on Mars now. There will be once there are resourceful people there. Now, to answer the question in more specifically, okay, the first several
30
missions-
seconds.
Okay. An inventor's colony. On Mars, you're going to have a group of technologically adept people in a frontier environment where they're free to innovate and forced to innovate, and they're going to innovate, and their inventions that they do to manage their situation on Mars will be licensable on Earth. That's what we're going to export from Mars. We're going to export inventions.
Good answer. All right. That last question. Is everyone scared? Let me ask my last question then. Back when I first started reporting on these things, and people had the old machines versus humans debate about what we should be paying to send into the solar system, you know, artificial intelligence was sort of in one of its winters, and it wasn't considered to be, people were not imagining that we would have the technologies even that we have right now in self-driving cars. So looking out on the timelines that we're talking here, 15, 20 years, do we still think we'll want to send humans in 10 years or 15 years? Or will there be other things we can send that have more of our capabilities?
Have more capabilities?
Have more of our capabilities.
Have more of our capabilities. Yeah, we could send some things that have more of our capabilities, but let me just talk about human beings for a minute. When we talk about AI, what we're really talking about is the ability to do computation at very, very high rates of speed, using a tremendous amount of data that then leads the machine to be able to help the human, or it leads the machine itself to come to certain conclusions as a result of that rationality. No question, but that capability is greatly advancing, no question at all. However, human beings make use of information that comes in ways that we are completely unconscious of. We make use of information that comes in through our fingertips. We make use of information that comes in through our feet. We make use of information that comes in through our hearing, through touch of our hair, through what we're seeing, through language, through all kinds of. There is yet no mechanism. There's very early, and I mean early, rudimentary work, okay, on processing via a whole lot of different sensory channels information into an AI. Until we're able to do that, and then gift the AI with the capability to be in a novel environment, look around that environment, see some outcropping rock, think, what is that? Okay, basically go up to it and start hypothesizing at a tremendous tremendous rate of speed, okay, about what it might be, to even recognize that it's a novel thing that it needs to be paying attention to, okay, we are nowhere near that. Sorry, guys, with regard to AI. We may get there, okay, but we are nowhere near that. There's a lot of other arguments about why he would send human beings out there, but in terms of the sheer science, capability for knowledge, capability for discovery, and capability for actually transforming ourselves, which will happen once we start going out there, there is no comparison to human beings.
Let's end it on the pro-humans note. Thank you very much.